Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Leslie with the New Mexico Small Business Development Center, and I'm proud to introduce Larry Donahue, an attorney here in New Mexico, practicing attorney here in New Mexico. He always gives us such valuable information. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A. Today's webinar is going to be personal liability and how to avoid it, such a hot topic. I also want to remind everyone that the New Mexico Small Business Development Center strongly encourages New Mexico small businesses to be aware of the risks to their cybersecurity. We have a series of cybersecurity webinars that are available pre-recorded on demand on our YouTube channel, and I'll chat over the YouTube link in the chat function so you can pick it up and watch those at your leisure. Again, if you have any questions, type them in the Q&A. Larry does a great job of monitoring it and picking up the questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Larry for personal liability and how to avoid it.
Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Whether you're on the live webinar now or you're looking at one of the replays later, what we're going to be talking about is personal liability and avoiding it. And interestingly enough, that seems like a pretty boring title. But if we were to say, why form an LLC? If we talked about LLCs, we'd probably get a lot more people attending. But interestingly enough, the reason you'd want to form an LLC is for liability protection. That's one of the big benefits of operating a business under an LLC. We're going to discuss that in a little more detail in a few minutes. But avoiding personal liability should be a very important component of your business and your goals and objectives when running your business. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, help you understand where the issues are, and then of course, how to avoid those issues and avoid personal liability. Before I get started, I do want to call to your attention that the New Mexico SBDC has a lot of great resources and information for small businesses and medium businesses. We encourage you to, contact them. If you need any help or guidance or advice, they can also refer you to, good resources for your business, whether they're CPAs, lawyers, and so on. And we also want to call to your attention, we're still got a pandemic going on, and who knows where things are going to end up or land here with the new Delta variant. So please be aware of these resources and keep up to date with what the local and state rules are, as well as what CDC guidelines and suggestions are. That's going to really help you in your business. You really need to be, keep on top of all of that. With that said, my name is Larry Donahue. I'm an attorney. I've been a lawyer almost 30 years. And before I get moving on this, I want to just remind you, to mute your audio if you haven't set your Zoom ratio to fit window. We find that's the best way to get the right aspect ratio for the words that we have on our presentations. And then we'll take Q&A throughout the presentation. So just type it in and we'll do our best to answer that. We're going to address personal liability and how to minimize personal liability. In order to do that, it's important for you to understand what personal liability is, how it happens, and then of course, how to minimize that. And I think a great way to understand all of that, aside from explaining it, is to share with you some nightmare stories that I've encountered through the 30 years of my life that has been a lawyer. Finally, before I begin, I got to give you the disclaimer. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. The New Mexico SBDC is not a law firm, so they cannot give legal advice. What you need to do is interpret everything I tell you as general business advice. And what's really important, you need to understand is a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be very fact specific, and it may be completely wrong for your specific circumstances. Also, different jurisdictions have different rules in edge cases, nuances around a lot of this. So if you are dealing with the specific issue, I strongly encourage you to contact the right professional to help you or advise you as appropriate. With all of that said, let's jump into the presentation. The first, issue here I think we have to ask ourselves is what is personal liability? And I think most people, if you rent or own a home, outside the context of business, think about somebody getting injured in your home, whether you're renting or you own. There will possibly be a legal responsibility for that injury, and therefore could subject you to medical bills. That's what personal liability is. You would be personally liable for the medical expenses associated with somebody injured in the premises or home that you control, your domain, if you will. And that's one of the reasons why you'd have homeowners insurance. Now, we're not here to talk about the personal side of personal liability. We're here to talk about businesses and personal liability in the context of business. And so you need to understand that it's a much broader, a much greater degree of risk associated with that. It's not just dealing with people who get injured. It's dealing with any form of liability that could attach to the business and therefore potentially attach to the owner or owners of the business. So yes, that would include physical injuries, but a lot of other things, debts and financial obligations, other obligations to perform something or not do something, damage to property, assets, inventory, loss of inventory. You could potentially be liable for expected profits or a loss of revenues, depending on the situation and circumstances. You could potentially be liable for a breach in a legal duty, not paying taxes properly, not obtaining a business license or permit that you didn't know about. That can all be potential liability that would attach to the business and or yourself. So personal liability means in this discussion, any and all debts, obligations, liabilities of the business. That's what can attach to you personally if you're not careful. So we are going to discuss why avoiding personal liability is so important, and then what you do about it. And what you got to remember is that as a business owner, you could be liable for the harms of the business, and the business itself can do all sorts of harms. Those harms could potentially be actionable or come back to you. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, debts, liabilities, obligations of the company itself while it's operating. But that's not all. You could have negligent or bad behavior on the part of others, even if you didn't authorize or approve the behavior, even if you train and demand and require people act differently, but they don't, and somebody gets hurt, or there's a loss or a problem somewhere, that can still come back to you under what's called the law of agency. So harms caused by your partners, by employees, contractors, anybody that's working for you, as well as mistakes people have made that you are relying on. So for example, if you were relying on me, the lawyer, to advise you properly, and I do not advise you properly, are you still liable? You bet you're liable, even though I gave you bad legal advice. Now, if I gave you bad legal advice, you can potentially come back after me for legal malpractice. But can you sue an accountant for legal malpractice? No. Now, can you go after an accountant if they commit some sort of malpractice? Maybe, if they're still alive, if they have the ability to reimburse you for the damage that was caused by the bad advice, but it's not an absolute possibility. So you need to be aware of the fact that even professionals like myself, if we give bad information, you are still on the hook as it relates to your business. And that's a really important thing for you to remember. But you can get in trouble and create liabilities in other ways. Failure to follow rules and regulations. What would that mean? Well, a rule or regulation might be to get a permit to drive a specific vehicle carrying hazardous materials. And you may not have known that the specific material you're carrying is hazardous. So you violated a rule or regulation. Similarly, not following the law. So the law would be something like you have to drive the speed limit. And if you go over that, you're violating the law. Granted, maybe it's a minor infraction, but you're still violating the law. But if somebody gets hurt by your truck, by your company truck, because the company truck is speeding, you have what's called negligence per se. It's negligence, and it's clear it's negligent because you are violating the law. And then if you don't have the right insurance, you don't have the right protections in place, you personally can be liable, even though a low wage, minimum wage worker was speeding and your company policy is to not speed, to follow the speed limit. You're still on the hook. So the other aspect is we're going to talk about how you protect yourself, but there are other issues associated with protecting yourself. And one is you're going to hear me talk about companies and corporate entities and insurance. We're going to discuss those things. But even if you have them, they're not foolproof. Nothing can protect you 100%. So if you have an entity, let's say an LLC, the entity could potentially be pierced. It's called the legal doctrine of piercing the corporate veil. And a plaintiff's lawyer, that is somebody who's representing the party suing you and your company, if they feel the company does not have enough assets or insurance or ability to cover the harm, they're going to try and attach to you personally as well. They're going to name you in the lawsuit personally and say, we're allowed to do that because we should be able to pierce the corporate veil. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you're doing something wrong and the plaintiff needs to prove it. And that might involve commingling something, not just money. It could be resources. It could be the space. You know, you're operating out of your home. And so that's a big potential problem if you don't have a very clear delineation between what's the business and the rest of your business, your home. You could not be following corporate formalities. You could fail to adequately capitalize the company. And what does that mean? It means you purposely pull money out of the company so that it is poor and unable to satisfy its debts or obligations. And if you do that purposefully, you may be viewed as failing to adequately capitalize the company and therefore give a plaintiff's attorney an excuse or ammunition to argue they should be able to pierce the corporate veil and go after you personally. Finally, this one should be a no-duh, right? If you have a company, a corporation, and you're committing an illegal act or an enterprise, and so here's the outrageous example. You have a cocaine cartel. You're purposely using the company to operate some sort of legal enterprise. Do you think that's going to prevent you from personally going to jail? Of course not. And so you have the same thing. If you're engaging in wrongful activity, fraudulent activity, illegal activity, that is, you're going to have personal liability associated with that. And if your agents are doing that, that can be imputed to you as well, even if you may not have knowledge of it in certain circumstances. There is an alter ego theory associated with this. And, there's not a real separation between you and the company. You kind of operate the company as an extension of yourself. That could then give somebody ammunition to argue piercing the corporate veil. So let me give you a couple of nightmare stories at this point before I go further. And one of them is a landscaper was a client of mine. And he relied on the family bookkeeper. He inherited the landscaping business from his father and continued to operate it as his father had done for 40 some odd years. And he relied on and used the family bookkeeper to keep track of everything, the money in and out expenses, as well as how to pay gross receipts tax. Well, it turns out that family bookkeeper might have been a great bookkeeper, but wasn't really up on the laws in New Mexico regarding gross receipts tax. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to you, but laws change on occasion. Tax rates change on occasion. What is or isn't excludable or includable in the gross receipts tax calculation is going to change over time. Well, this bookkeeper wasn't keeping track of all of that, wasn't keeping track of the updates, and just continued to operate and pay gross receipts tax as they had done for many, many, many years in the past. And guess what? The New Mexico Taxation Revenue Department, New Mexico NMTRD, decided that, or figured out that, hey, you are underpaying tax, and you've been doing that for many years. The New Mexico Tax and Rev came on board and said, did an audit, and then figured out that taxes were underpaid to the tune of $65,000 or so over the span of a number of years. I want to say it was 7 or 8. That's as far back as they can go. And so when you factor in penalties and interest, my client was on the hook for over $200 and something thousand associated with the unpaid gross receipts tax of approximately $65,000 spread over the 7 or 8 years. I forget the exact number. And I don't remember exactly how much it was in the 200s. It was, I want to say 240 something thousand, but I could be off by a little bit. But it's still a huge hit to the business. The problem with my client was they were not an LLC or corporation. They were a sole proprietorship. So who owned that tax obligation? They did, not the LLC or the corporation, and not the bookkeeper either. They were responsible. So what they did is they decided to, say, we're going to declare bankruptcy. And so they declared bankruptcy. But guess what? You can't discharge all debts in bankruptcy, just certain debts in bankruptcy. And furthermore, the way it works, that they could discharge, well, they could sort of discharge those debts and obligations, but the business still owed those taxes. So while New Mexico Tax and Rev had to stop going after our client because of the bankruptcy and the gross receipts taxes, my client only knows landscaping. So my landscaping client opened up a new business, decided to do it properly and do it under an LLC. But guess what? New Mexico Tax and Rev came back and said, hey, that is a successor business. It is because it's owned by you, the landscaper, we can go after that business for the unpaid tax debt that you tried to get discharged in bankruptcy. So my client, who only knows landscaping, kept getting hit and shut down by New Mexico Tax and Rev because of this personal obligation associated with not just the unpaid gross receipts tax, which might have been doable, but the penalties and interest that were tacked onto that as well. And that is still a problem to this client to this day. So that'd be an example of a nightmare story you wouldn't want to find yourself in. And it wasn't really our client's fault. It was the bookkeeper's fault. But does New Mexico Tax and Rev care? Well, they might care, but there's nothing they can do about it. The business, who is my client, is on the hook. Now, my client can certainly go after the bookkeeper, but you're probably figuring out where this is going. Older bookkeeper ended up dying, unfortunately, during the span of these events, and so was unavailable to be able to go after to try and help pay for their mistakes associated with my client's underpaying gross receipts tax. Let's give you another nightmare story. This one's the criminal and the used car dealership. We represented the used car dealership. I can't tell you who, I can't involve manufacturers, I can't let you figure out who this is. But what I can tell you is, what do used car dealers do? They sell cars, right? Do you just walk onto a lot, point at a car and say, I want to buy that car and take it? No, you want to test drive it, right? So that is part of the integral process of selling a vehicle. So my client, the used car dealership, had somebody come on to the parking lot and say, hey, there's this vehicle they really like, and they would like to, is it okay to test drive it and so on? And the sales guy, eager to make a sale, said, of course. Now it was snowing out. So my client's sales guy gets into the vehicle, drives it to the front office, leaving the key in it to warm up, runs in to the office to open up the gate on the parking lot. That whole thing took 30 seconds, little less. Run in, run out. By the time the sales guy ran back to the car, the guy who was saying they wanted to buy this vehicle moves over to the driver's seat and drives off with the vehicle. Literally steals the vehicle from the dealership because the gate's open, they have the keys started, they go. Now, that's not all that happened. 2 days later, 2 full days later, of course, they filed a police report for a missing vehicle, stolen vehicle, all of that. 2 days later, this criminal who stole the vehicle gets into a shooting situation with the cops, and a cop gets hurt, a cop gets shot. Terrible set of circumstances. But that cop then files a lawsuit against my client claiming negligence, saying, hey, you were negligent in the way you handled this. You should never have left the vehicle unattended to allow this guy to steal the vehicle. Now, be that as it may, how does that relate to then the cop getting shot, right? So it's a very weak case from the police officer's standpoint, although, heart goes out to them, but there isn't really a case of negligence here. But the insurance company said that they weren't going to defend, and I don't remember the reason, by the way. They said our client was responsible, there was an intentional act here somehow, and failed to defend our client. So they still had to pay our legal fees fighting off this potential lawsuit. So that would be another example of where a terrible liability could attach to the business and then therefore attach to our client if the insurance doesn't work out, if the LLC doesn't work out, if the company doesn't have enough assets and they go after him personally. So you need to think about these crazy situations that you might not normally think about. Stuff can be out of your control, and liability can still attach to you or your business. So who could potentially sue you? The answer is just about anyone. It could be a partner in a partnership dispute, a lawsuit against the company, and they're trying to go after the members personally for some reason. It could be a tax audit or discrepancy somehow. It could be a funding institution, the banks, the SBA. We're hearing issues of SBA and coming back after businesses or sole proprietors specifically on not the proper amounts given or distributed for PPP or other loans or relief funds. Finance companies, of course, there's just about anybody can come after you. And that includes, customers, potential customers, employees, contractors, and those that aren't with you anymore. They want to come back after you for some reason. Vendors and former vendors, even your competition. So how could your competition potentially sue you? A lot of ways. Maybe you hired one of their former employees and their former employee starts sharing trade secret information with your business. Or maybe there's a contract between your competitor and your new employee. And that competitor then says you tortiously interfered with contractual relations. If they could prove that maybe you had knowledge of that contract somehow, or they breached the contract like the non-compete clause. Now, in some states, that's not going to apply. In New Mexico and other states, it could apply or will apply. Depends on the circumstances. But that's not all. You have the local, county, state, and federal government and agencies to worry about. And in particular, we see over and over and over again, New Mexico Workforce Solutions going after small businesses. We see, I mentioned it in one of my examples, New Mexico Taxation and Revenue Department. Now, Some people there are just great. They try to work with the businesses. Others aren't so great and seem to care less. One of the things tying the hands of the New Mexico Taxation and Revenue Department is that there are some constitutional limitations imposed on what the state can do in terms of negotiating tax debts and burdens and obligations. And so while you can negotiate with the IRS in certain circumstances, you can't necessarily negotiate in those same circumstances with New Mexico Tax and Rev. We also see NMRLD, the Regulation and Licensing Department, have a lot of issues with a lot of small businesses. We see the US Department of Labor and the IRS. Those are probably the five organizations that seem to come up a lot with businesses. And Workforce Solutions and Department of Labor deal with employee issues and disputes, including contractors. And a lot of businesses get tripped up on whether somebody's a contractor versus an employee. On the Taxation and Revenue Department and the IRS, we see a lot of issues with income tax issues and gross receipts tax issues. And then finally, with the Regulation and Licensing Department, a lot of different businesses that are required to be licensed or are otherwise regulated in some way don't know all the issues or don't get the right permissions, or there's disputes and they got to deal with that somehow. So you really need to assume everyone could potentially be out to get you. And your goal here is to protect yourself. And most businesses understand that it's good to put a company around you, operate as a company, a corporate entity of some sort. And we'll discuss that in a minute. And when you do that, that gives you a layer of protection. But I put a dashed line around it because it's not perfect. It's not absolute. There are many ways to breach it. There's another line of protection, and that's insurance. And I put a dashed line around that as well, because again, it's not absolute and it's not perfect. Each one of these can be considered layers to help protect you, but at the end of the day, nothing is perfect for a lot of reasons. And what are those reasons? Well, it kind of depends on who is coming after you and for what. So one example would be customers. You know, if you've breached a contract, if you haven't performed the way they were hoping you'd perform, if a product fails, a service hurts somebody, you expect customers to come after you. And why else would you have insurance? That's one of the primary reasons for insurance, but that doesn't mean it's going to cover all circumstances, and we'll discuss that in a minute. Another area to worry about are your employees or ex-employees, and hopefully you have the right insurance for that as well. But I'll give you an example where businesses get tripped up all the time. That's workman's comp. I have client after client telling me, oh, they don't need workman's comp. And then they tell me what kind of business they're in. And I'm like, you absolutely have to have workman's comp. Or they say, I don't have enough employees. And I ask them how many employees they tell me one or two. And then I say, well, how many owners? And then they tell me 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever it is. And they don't think owners apply when you look at the number of employees for workman comp purposes. And the answer to that is it depends on the state. It depends on the nature of your business. And in New Mexico, 3, if you have 3 employees or more. So if you have 2 employees, you're okay, but you get to 3 employees or more, you need workman's comp insurance. Now, in most cases, some businesses, it doesn't matter how many employees you have to have workman's comp insurance. But the point is that an owner is an employee for workman's comp purposes, at least in New Mexico. So if you have an employee getting hurt, claiming workman's comp, and you don't have workman's comp, well, then that insurance thing doesn't apply for that particular circumstance, does it? There are other problems. Lenders, I talked about banks, financial companies, and they got a big hammer and they can crack through some of this. Why is the hammer cracking your company and not insurance? Well, because insurance isn't going to cover debts and financial stuff. That's not what insurance is for. So that insurance layer of protection doesn't even apply when we're talking about lenders. And when I was doing this presentation, I was debating whether I should put that hammer on you directly versus the company. And why? Well, a lot of times you might sign a personal guarantee with a lender, a landlord, for example, or a bank. And so they could potentially go after you personally by default and bypass the layer of protection that you might get from a corporate entity. Finally, we have the government, and I gave them a rocket here, a bazooka, because they could just shoot right through all these layers and come right after you, depending on the circumstances and what you do. So if you are, doing some sort of criminal activity, or one of your people commits a crime somehow, if you're not paying taxes, bankruptcy will not discharge certain tax debts and obligations. There's a lot of ways the government has a bazooka just to go shoot right through all of this mess and come after you directly. And then finally, there's all kinds of other people that we kind of talked about that might fit under one of these umbrellas, vendors, partners, guests, people you haven't even sold anything to. They just happen to walk on your premises with or without your permission. Competition, all kinds of people. So let's talk about one more nightmare story, and then we're going to talk about how to protect yourself. This one involves a narcissistic lawyer. And by the way, I'm not a psychologist. I can't say for sure whether this person was narcissistic or not, but boy, sure seemed like it. Our client was a restaurant chain. This lawyer was hired by that restaurant chain as their HR director. And this individual, everybody was out to get this individual. Would, heaven forbid, if the board of directors wanted to do things a certain way and disagreed with the HR director, or was willing to accept certain types of risk or obligations, this HR director would just have a heart attack, cry, make everything personal. And what this lawyer started doing, because they're a lawyer, they're trained to know how certain issues might impact the business. This lawyer set up the company over a period of a couple of years, and through their own actions and advice, by the way. So could it be argued they committed malpractice against their employer? Maybe. Very hard argument to make, because most law is really put in place to protect the employee, not the other way around. The employment laws on the books are there to protect employees, right? Against discrimination, against bad treatment, against, for certain harms, protect for safety. So when you have somebody trained on HR issues, and then they go and set the company up to trip over some of those issues, we have a big problem on our hands. And this created problems for the company, not just with this particular HR director, but with other employees as well. So it was a rogue lawyer, kind of the wolf in the henhound is what we had going on here. And it created all kinds of problems long-term that took a long time to fix. And the nightmare lesson here is even if you hire an expert to help you with something, doesn't necessarily mean it's getting done correctly. Isn't that a scary thought? So what do you do about it? It's a good question. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So here is the general, if you take away any slide, this is it. It's about layers of protection. And you have yourself on the left-hand side, you have lawsuits and people on the right-hand side. And the question is, how do you prevent that from getting to you? And the answer is, you have a number of different sort of shields or barriers to try and protect you. None of them is perfect. None of them is going to help 100%, but hopefully with the combination of them, they will prevent them from eventually reaching you. And so I'm going to go from left to right. We're going to talk about corporate entities in a moment, but you should never be operating as a sole proprietorship or partnership. Yes, those are valid business entities. No, they will not protect you from personal liability if a problem happens. You also need great people, not good people, and definitely not bad people. You need great people so that they are going to do the right thing. They aren't going to lie. They are going to be smart enough to know when there's a potential problem to raise it to you so that you can then take remediating action to prevent it from turning into a disaster. You have insurance, and insurance is going to help you as well, but not in all cases. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. Finally, a lot of businesses kind of stop there and say, well, I got an LLC, I got insurance, what more do I need? Well, the answer is a lot. Aside from great people, you also need great processes, and you need to follow the law. Well, how do you follow the law? It requires you to know what the law is. And then if you're going to be one of those people that says, oh, well, I think I know what the law is, well, you better be damn sure, number one. And then two, if you're one of those people that says, well, the law is X, and so I'm going to get right up to the edge there. Well, you better understand what the contours then are so that there isn't an exception or some other thing that can implicate the law or violating a rule or a permit or something. I'll give you an example. We had a client who does event planning, and one of the events ended up being a wedding and food needed to be served. And they said, oh, well, we don't have to worry about food permits because that's why we're going to hire a food vendor. They got to worry about the permit. Well, my event planning client didn't decide to really understand the nuances of all of that. And turns out the vendor they hired had lost their license for some reason. I don't remember the exact circumstances. Maybe it was the permit or license that they had was within their premises, not to deliver and serve food elsewhere, is I think what happened. So my client ended up not verifying that and talking about it to the vendor they hired, and somebody claimed to get sick, and somebody then filed a report, and it becomes a big problem. City comes down hard after my client, the event planner, saying, you are planning this event, you're the one that was responsible for this. And so not only now that they have liability with the city, they have liability with their client, who they were supposed to provide a great event for. They're potentially liable and on the hook for whomever's claiming to get sick. It just turns into a huge nightmare. So you want the right processes and to follow the law. So hopefully nobody then needs to deal with your insurance or needs to deal with your people, or you have to fall back on the fact that you hopefully have the right liability protection with your corporate umbrella. So let's talk about that. First issue is the corporate entity. You should be operating under a corporate entity. LLCs are very inexpensive and easy to set up. They're easy to maintain. They're easy and inexpensive to take down. And by the way, footnote, when you hear a lawyer say easy, think less expensive. And that is the opposite, is where I say hard or difficult, then think expensive. So corporations can also provide liability protection. The same level of liability protection. Corporations aren't better or worse than LLCs for liability protection, but they're more formal. They have a more formal structure. Therefore, they cost a little more to set up. They cost more to maintain. They cost more to take down. And because the structure is more formal, that means you need to follow the corporate formalities a little more carefully. You need to have regular shareholder meetings, even if it's just yourself. You need to document those. When the company does something, you need to have a formal corporate resolution that's signed and agreed to and voted on by all the shareholders, even if it's just yourself. So a little more work there. Nonprofits are a pain in the neck. I get a lot of people that say, oh, well, I want to do business and I want to do good and I want to have a nonprofit. And that's all well and good, but you need to understand Nonprofits, you have to have a board of directors. You aren't necessarily in control of those board of directors either. You need to submit the right documentation. You need to make sure that that's done regularly. Stuff can be audited. It's more expensive to do. So I would argue, step number one is do the do good that you want to do. And then if it has some legs and if it's moving, and if you think you can get more money into the company from donors who want a tax write-off, now nonprofits start making more sense. Think of it though as having a child. It's not just simply the fact that you've started or formed an LLC or a corporation. You got to do more than that. You have to form it, and then you have to operate as the business through that corporation. And a lot of people get confused with this. I've had a client, they started an LLC years ago, but they weren't operating under it. And that, it makes it worthless. You have to, the business has to be the company has to be the business. And who the heck are you? You are just somebody who owns and or works for that business. You are not the business itself. And so what's an easy way to think of it? Well, think of it as having a child, and the child is the business. So it's a child. They can't sign contracts. You do, but you do it in the child's name because you are the parent or guardian of the child. The equivalent in the company world is you're a manager, you're a shareholder, an officer, director, some sort of authorized representative of that corporate entity. The child's name, not yours, is a party to the contracts. So, how many leases do you think I've reviewed that were for businesses, that were corporations or LLCs, and one of the owners named is on the lease? At least 30 to 40% of the time we get into lease dispute issues for our clients, we see not even the right name is set up on the lease. Your personal name doesn't go on the lease. The name, the legal name of the corporate entity, your company LLC, your company Inc., whatever it is, the actual legal name needs to go on the lease. Now, if the landlord says, no, I want to hold you personally responsible, what they're referring to is a personal guarantee. I do not want your name on the lease. I hope I can't be any clearer here. Your name does not go on the lease. The name of the company goes on the lease, as well as other contracts, bank accounts, and so on. It's not your bank account. It's the LLC's or the corporation's bank account. You are a signer on such bank account. The child, the LLC, the company is paid, not you. Checks aren't written out to your name. They're written out to the company's name. They're deposited in the company's bank account, not your personal bank account. The child, the company, pays others, not you. So if you have employees, contractors, suppliers, the company pays them through the company bank account, not you. And if the company doesn't have money, then you lend the company money. You give the company money through a capital contribution. Those are different things. You need to talk to an accountant on what that means, but I don't want you writing a personal check to somebody in furtherance of the business. You write the check to the company deposits it in their bank account, and then the bank account, the company bank account, then pays that supplier or vendor as necessary or appropriate. Insurance. You need lots of insurance, not just one insurance plan. You need several depending on the kind of business you're in. I talked about workers' comp, for example. That is a must-have for many types of businesses, and most businesses, depending on the size. You need a general liability policy. That is, think of it as an umbrella. So if something happens, the umbrella policy or general liability policy will cover it. But general liability excludes a lot of things. So you may not have to, or may not be able to stop just general liability. There's professional liability, depending on whether you're a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant or somebody that's providing some sort of professional or licensed or regulated services to somebody. There's cyber insurance if you're doing any business online nowadays or relying on information. There's products liability if you're manufacturing or even just selling products. You need to think about that. Also, there's key man and key life insurance, and that relates to partners and partnerships. If you have other owners of the company, think of it as life insurance for the company. If one of the owners or key people dies, it gives the company money to be able to buy out the estate of that deceased partner, for example, or it gives the company money to be able to go and find somebody else high level, maybe pay them a signing bonus or something like that to get them to move over to your company. It's critical that you talk to your business insurance agent regularly. You need to make sure you have the right coverages, and that as your business changes, you would expect your policies to change too. They just do. And insurance doesn't have to be expensive if it's tailored for your business. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have a one-person paper route, you probably don't need a $10 million general liability policy. You could do the minimum, whatever that is, but it depends on the type of business. What you care about is the type of coverage, the coverage amounts, and the deductibles. Those things are going to constantly change over time. And one of the best ways to control the amount of insurance you pay, or the cost of insurance, is going to be that deductible. So if your business has cash on hand, then maybe you can afford a higher deductible. That's going to greatly reduce the cost of insurance. And likewise, if you don't have a lot of cash on hand, you probably want to do the reverse and keep the deductible low. And that is going to increase the cost of insurance. But it's critical that you talk to your business insurance agent at least yearly. And how many of you watching this right now has actually read the declarations page and exclusions of the various insurance policies? I bet most of you haven't, and that's a problem. You need to read those and make sure they apply to your business. And if they don't, you may need special riders. You may be overinsured and paying for things you don't need. That's an excellent way to get down the cost of insurance. Now, I'll tell you, insurance companies and agents love to sell packages. And basically, think of it as like a television package, especially in earlier days of cable. You just wanted 3 or 4 channels, but you got to go and buy 50 of them to get the 3 or 4 that you want. So you're really overpaying to get your 3 channels. Nowadays, that's being disaggregated somewhat. It's easier to just get the channels you want. Still not, if you're me, there's a couple of channels that I just must have, and it just seems like it's impossible to get those specific channels. But insurance is kind of the same way. They'll try to package it up and sell you more than you actually need. And it's possible that insurance company X you're doing business with doesn't give you any other options. But then that's a perfect excuse to go and check out other insurance companies or agents or brokers and see if they can find another mix of coverages that you need without the coverages you don't need. And similarly, gaps. Does the insurance policies you have gaps based on what you do? And if so, that's something you need to look at as well, because insurance is only as good as those coverages that you have. And it's going to be more expensive if you don't have what you need, and then you're not getting the protection that you want. So this is a very strong area, and I'm sorry to belabor it so much, but you would be surprised when I talk to people. When's the last time you've talked to your insurance agent? They don't even remember. Years ago. I'm like, well, I promise you, if you've been growing in revenues or employees or geographic scope or in what you do or what you sell, your insurance is probably outdated. You probably got a lot of gaps. So, but it's not just about layers of protection. There's more to the picture. And one of them is people. I cannot tell you and stress how important it is to hire the best people for your business. Think of partners, for instance. Your company is only going to be as good as the owners. And so do you want to work with a partner who maybe isn't dedicated to your business, or maybe isn't similarly minded as you are in terms of your scope and your mission and how you do things? Do you want a partner that can't afford to, inject capital into the company if needed, or maybe can't afford to not get paid once or twice just to, if there's a cash crunch. You really need the right partner in order for your business to succeed. And just think about it for a minute. If you have a company, and then what would be the ideal partner to just really meet your goals and objectives? Do you care about growth? Do you care about a certain industry or market segment? Or, what is it you care about? And then what would be the ideal partner for that? I would assume somebody really smart, really dedicated, really focused. Why settle for less, right? Focus on finding the right partner for your business. But don't stop there. You want to hire the best, the smartest, competent, honest people for your business, because imagine what the opposite can do for your business. Don't settle. And I know especially today where it seems like it's really hard to find people, so you're willing to take anybody. I promise you, problems are going to magnify over time if you don't hire good people. Do not let your standards down. That includes your employees, contractors, and professionals, CPAs, lawyers. Now, you need to understand, a bookkeeper is not a CPA. You have bookkeepers, accountants, and then CPAs in terms of skill, capability, and the ability to kind of help your business. So if you are hiring a bookkeeper to make decisions about how to pay taxes, how to do a chart of accounts, how to appropriately do taxes, that's not a bookkeeper, that's an accountant. And if you are, doing a lot of stuff, a lot of interesting stuff, it may be outside the realm of a bookkeeper and you really need a CPA. I strongly encourage you to hire the right type of individual, especially on the finances, so you don't get yourself into trouble, like I had mentioned before. But even lawyers, just because they're a dang lawyer doesn't mean that they're right for your business. Use that, remember that example I gave you earlier where we had that narcissistic lawyer working as an HR director for a restaurant chain. You don't want to have yourself in that situation. So it's always good to be able to verify, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You also want strong contracts. The strong contracts are not something you've downloaded off the internet. It is something that you've custom tailored for your business. I mean, you can certainly start with something off the internet, but make sure you customize it and fit it for your specific business, for your specific circumstances. You want a dispute resolution clause in there. You want clear duties and obligations for both parties. You want indemnities and limited liabilities and limitations and warranties as it relates to you and your performance, if appropriate. You want an attorney's fees clause. You don't want somebody like a vendor who may have more money than you, or a lawyer that works for them, or as a family friend yanking your chain. You need to be able to say, look, if we're going to get into dispute, and if you're going to sue me or I have to sue you, I think the prevailing party should get their attorney's fees paid. That really helps get rid of bad actors. And you have better good faith negotiations and actors, in my opinion, when you have an attorney's fees clause. But it's not just about good people. And by the way, imagine the opposite. You hire somebody who's not smart or not competent or not honest. Can you imagine how much trouble they can get in, or they do things and you don't know about and then get sued later for them? That's a great way to get your company liable about something. And that's what you want to avoid. On processes, what do I mean by that? Well, I got a little test for you, and that's this. Data, right? Data. What is that? Well, how fast a truck goes, how, the time it takes to get from point A to point B, the temperature, whether it has oil properly changed in it. Data is like basic numbers. And we all, as business owners, can get overwhelmed with the data. The question is, do we have the right processes and systems and tools in place to turn that data into information, right? Instead of caring about the temperature and whether the oil is changed and how fast we're going, we'd like to know, is the truck operating optimally? Is it, are we, the tires at the appropriate inflation level so that I'm maximizing my fuel economy? I care about the higher level information. But not only that, information eventually becomes knowledge, right? Instead of, is this truck operating optimally? Do I have a fleet of vehicles that is minimizing my costs and maximizing my logistics? That's knowledge. Finally, wisdom. Do I have the right vehicles that are operating optimally? And is that going to be what's best for me and my business in the long term? Do I need to be moving towards different fuels? Do I need to be thinking about electric vehicles or self-operated vehicles, for example? So the question is, where are you and your people on this spectrum? And if you're more on the left, you have more issues. You have more potential problems for failure or problems that might not get communicated up the branch or to yourself to be able to take remediating action and help reduce long-term costs and expenses or to avoid a lawsuit. So what do? You need to think about the right training, the right testing, the verification and validation. You need to fold that into your business. You need to hire the best people and the best trained people, and you need to keep training them. You need to automate your processes and your systems where possible. You need to seek professional guidance and opinions. There was a coffee mug that I saw that said, and I'm not a doctor, I'm a lawyer, but it said, don't confuse your 30 minutes of internet research with my medical degree. And that's just, I love that. And there's a similar thing, right? Don't confuse your 30 minutes of internet research with fill in the blank. Being a tax professional, being a lawyer, contact the right people and make sure that what you are doing is not just right and proper, but maybe the best approach. And is it geared towards how the future is going to change? And one thing you may not have known, but if you are not sure about something, you can get a legal opinion and it could remove culpability if the legal opinion is in your favor. That may mean you're not sure if you need a permit or not. You're not sure if it's legal or not. You're not sure if it's the right way to calculate taxes. So if you rely on a legal opinion, or if it's a tax thing, you rely on a tax lawyer or CPA's opinion. Now, that doesn't mean you didn't commit an illegal act, or it doesn't mean you didn't pay taxes properly, but it could take away the penalties, the criminal penalties, the financial penalties in certain circumstances. So think about that as an option if you're not sure of where things land on something. And that is the last of it. I do have one more nightmare story, but we're running out of time. But what I will say is I had a client who had done everything correct, but still ended up getting sued by a lawyer. That's all they do is sue in class action lawsuits for what my client does. So this lawyer basically got a specific individual to buy product from my client and then use that against them in a class action lawsuit for false advertising. So even though my client thought they did everything correct, they ended up opening up the door for a potential false advertising claim that can be the subject of a class action lawsuit. And guess what? They needed the right insurance for that. They needed to be able to defend themselves against that. So you need to be thinking a little out of the box on what potentially could go wrong and make sure you have the right pieces in place to protect you. And that is it. And if there's any questions, I'll answer them, although we didn't get anything through the presentation, so I assume we don't have any more. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Larry. There's always so many. There's always you always give so much information. And so I want to remind everyone we are going to have it pre-recorded on demand up on our website right after this presentation. So you're going to be able to review it We do that for 1 week, and then after that, we put it on our YouTube channel, so it'll be available to view at your leisure after that. So we have these webinars available, but we also have the no-cost confidential counseling. So if you feel like you have need some more information, we're here to help you every step of the way. So we have 19 centers in your local. I'm sure we have one hopefully close to you, but we can connect you with someone locally. And Larry's going to be with us for a while. He's going to be doing a series of webinars throughout the month of September. So if you have questions and you want to address them in a future webinar, even if it's on this webinar, I'm sure he'll be glad to pick those up. And that is it for today. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.